You know, it's fascinating how people can walk away from something extraordinary, thinking they'll find peace in distance. Avoidance, those who fear deep emotional intimacy, often believe detachment is their strength. They tell themselves that needing no one means being free, but when they lose a super empath, that illusion begins to crumble. A super empath doesn't just love they see through walls, through silence, through avoidance. They give without keeping score, they nurture without demanding control, and they hold space for the broken parts of others that most people run from. But when that empath finally walks away drained, exhausted, and done trying, that's when the avoidance real breakdown begins. At first, they feel relief. They convince themselves they needed space, that the relationship was too intense. They might even frame it as toxic to soothe their guilt, but the quiet starts to echo. The silence they once craved becomes deafening. They start to remember the laughter, the patience, the way that empaths' love didn't demand perfection, just honesty, and suddenly they realize what they've lost wasn't someone ordinary. It was someone rare. Avoidants don't usually break down publicly, they collapse in solitude. They replay conversations in their head, rewrite endings that never happened, and watch from afar as the super empath rises again, glowing in peace, no longer chasing their love. That's when it hits them: the one person who could understand their silence, who could love them without judgment, is now gone, not out of anger, but out of self-respect, and that's the difference. Empaths don't leave to punish. They leave to protect. They choose themselves, and when that happens, the avoidant is left facing the one thing they've run from all along: their own emotions. The very thing they feared, being vulnerable, becomes the only way to heal. Because after losing a super empath, no amount of distraction, no new person, no temporary comfort can fill that space. So if you've ever been that empath walking away in silence, know this: your absence is your loudest statement. It's the mirror that forces the avoidant to see themselves clearly, maybe for the first time ever. And if you've ever been the avoidant, understand that your breakdown isn't punishment, it's your awakening. It's the start of finally learning that love isn't something to run from, it's something to grow into. Avoidants often believe that their emotional distance is a sign of strength, a form of control that keeps them safe from rejection or vulnerability. They convince themselves that by staying detached, they can manage relationships on their terms. No one can hurt them, no one can disappoint them, and no one can see the fear that sits beneath their surface. This illusion of control becomes their armor, but what they don't realize is that this armor doesn't protect them, it isolates them. It becomes the very reason they lose the people who could have loved them most genuinely. When an avoidant is in a relationship with a super empath, they are given something extremely rare: unconditional acceptance. The empath doesn't try to force their heart open, but instead offers consistent warmth, patience, and understanding. They see the avoidant's fear not as rejection, but as pain. For a while, this dynamic works: the empath gives, the avoidant withdraws, and somehow a fragile balance is maintained. But over time, that balance turns toxic. The empath begins to feel invisible, emotionally starved, and unacknowledged. They start realizing that loving someone who constantly runs from connection is like holding sand in your hands. No matter how gentle you are, it keeps slipping away. The avoidant, on the other hand, continues to tell themselves they are in control. They think, "I'm fine on my own," or "I just need space." But control built on fear isn't freedom. It's avoidance masquerading as independence. They distance themselves emotionally because closeness feels threatening, but what they don't anticipate is the emptiness that grows inside them when real intimacy fades. Their illusion of control gives them temporary peace but long-term loneliness. When the super empath finally reaches the point of exhaustion and decides to walk away, the avoidant doesn't immediately feel pain. Instead, there's a sense of relief, a false sense that they've regained control. They may even rationalize the loss, telling themselves it wasn't meant to be or that the relationship was too intense, but slowly that illusion starts to unravel. The silence left behind begins to echo louder than they expected. The peace they thought they wanted turns into a void that no distraction can fill. They start remembering the small things, the gentle reassurance, the emotional availability, the sense of being seen without judgment. It dawns on them that what they called control was actually avoidance, and what they thought was freedom was emotional fear in disguise. When they realize this, the breakdown begins. The image they built of themselves as self-reliant and unaffected starts to crack. They begin to see how their fear of losing control made them lose the one person who loved them for who they truly were. The more they reflect, the clearer it becomes that control was never about strength, it was about protection from pain. Ironically, that same protection becomes the source of their greatest suffering once the empath is gone. The presence of a super empath in an avoidance life is something that often feels both comforting and unsettling at the same time. Super empaths have an extraordinary ability to sense emotional energy, to read between the lines, and to love without judgment. They don't just hear what someone says, they feel what that person means even when words fail. To an avoidant, this can be both intoxicating and terrifying. For perhaps the first time, they are seeing clearly not the image they project, not the mask of independence they wear, but their true, vulnerable self. The super empath creates an environment where the avoidant feels safe to exist without pretending. They provide emotional warmth, patience, and compassion that few people can sustain. At first, the avoidant doesn't know how to handle it. They appreciate it, but they also fear it because deep down, being truly seen is their greatest discomfort. The empath's love is powerful because it doesn't demand perfection, it simply invites authenticity. It gives the avoidant space to breathe, yet it holds them gently accountable for their emotional patterns. The empath doesn't need them to change overnight, they only want connection, honesty, and mutual effort. But for an avoidant, that type of transparency feels like exposure. The more the empath tries to love them, the more they start to pull away. This push and pull dynamic becomes emotionally draining for both sides. The avoidant doesn't understand why they feel both comforted and suffocated by someone who only wants to love them. The empath begins to feel like they're pouring light into a well that never fills. And yet, even when faced with distance, the empath continues to love not because they are weak, but because they see the potential beneath the fear. Over time, the avoidant becomes dependent on that energy without realizing it. They grow accustomed to the emotional safety the empath provides. They know that no matter how distant they become, the empath will always try to understand, always show compassion, always be there with a soft heart. This emotional security becomes their invisible anchor. The avoidant may not verbalize it, but deep inside, they rely on the empath's consistency to balance their instability. The empath's love becomes the foundation that holds the avoidant's emotional world together. But when the empath finally begins to withdraw, when they stop chasing, stop explaining, stop softening the silence, everything shifts. The avoidant starts to feel the absence of that emotional grounding. The calm they took for granted turns into emptiness. That's when they realize the true power of the empath's presence. It wasn't just affection or attention they were given, it was emotional stability, spiritual warmth, and unconditional understanding. The empath's love had been the quiet force keeping their fears from consuming them. Losing that presence leaves them face to face with the emotional chaos they've avoided all along. Only then do they understand that what the empath offered wasn't ordinary love, it was healing. And healing, once gone, cannot be easily replaced. When a super empath finally walks away, the avoidance breakdown doesn't happen in dramatic scenes or public displays of sorrow. It happens quietly, in the privacy of their own mind, when the distractions stop working and the reality of loss begins to settle in. At first, they convince themselves they're fine. They may even feel lighter, as if a weight has been lifted. They might go out more, distract themselves with work, or seek comfort in new connections that demand nothing from them. But this relief doesn't last. Because beneath that temporary calm lies a deep and growing silence, one that the empath used to fill with understanding, laughter, and emotional safety. The avoidant doesn't immediately recognize what's missing. They just sense an emptiness that begins to stretch wider each day. What used to feel like freedom now feels like isolation, and what once seemed like peace now feels like an echo chamber of regret. Their collapse begins subtly. It's in the way they replay conversations in their head, wondering if they could have been softer, kinder, more open. It's in the way they scroll through old messages or photos, not to rekindle anything, but to reassure themselves that what they had was real. Avoidants are not devoid of emotion, they're overwhelmed by it. They suppress it for so long that when it finally catches up, it hits them like a storm. The empath's absence becomes a mirror reflecting everything they refused to confront: their fear of intimacy, their self-sabotage, and their inability to receive love without running from it. The quiet they once craved now becomes unbearable. Every memory of the empath, their voice, their patience, their warmth becomes a reminder of what they pushed away. Avoidants often break down not from the loss itself, but from the realization of what that loss represents. The super empath was not just a partner, they were the emotional grounding that kept the avoidant's inner chaos at bay. Without that steady, loving energy, the avoidant feels exposed to their own emotional instability. They try to suppress it again, diving deeper into avoidance, maybe through isolation, overworking, or shallow relationships. But nothing works the same way anymore, because once someone has experienced genuine emotional depth, superficiality can no longer satisfy. The empath's love taught them what real connection feels like, and now that it's gone, nothing else compares. So the avoidance collapse continues quietly in sleepless nights, in overthinking, in the ache of what-ifs. They might never admit it out loud, but inside, they know they've lost something rare. They remember how the empath didn't demand perfection, only honesty, how they were loved in ways that required no masks. And realizing they may never find that again becomes the heaviest part of their solitude. Their breakdown isn't loud because avoidants don't know how to express pain outwardly. They turn it inward where it grows in silence, eating away at the illusion of control they once clung to. And in that quiet unraveling, they finally begin to understand that the distance they created to protect themselves has become the very thing destroying them from within. When a super empath finally decides to walk away, it is rarely an impulsive act. It comes after countless moments of quiet endurance, after giving chance after chance, hoping the avoidant would meet them halfway. Empaths hold on longer than most because they see potential. They see the wounded inner child behind the avoidance walls, the one who fears being abandoned or misunderstood. But eventually, even the most giving heart reaches its breaking point. The empath realizes that love cannot thrive where emotional intimacy is constantly denied. They understand that staying any longer would mean losing themselves, so they make the hardest choice to leave. And when they do, it is not out of anger or revenge. It's an act of self-preservation, a declaration that their peace matters more than one-sided love. Their absence becomes more powerful than their presence ever was. The moment the empath walks away, everything begins to shift for the avoidant. For so long, they believed that the empath would never truly go. They mistook compassion for weakness, assuming that forgiveness would always follow their withdrawal. But this time, when the empath doesn't return, reality sets in. The messages stop coming, the gentle reassurance fades, and the emotional safety net disappears. That's when the avoidance walls, once so strong, start to crumble. The space that used to feel liberating now feels hollow. They begin to feel the weight of their own choices, realizing too late that in protecting themselves from vulnerability, they've destroyed the very bond that offered healing. The empath's departure becomes the mirror the avoidant never wanted to face. It reflects their emotional avoidance, their fear of closeness, and the ways they've sabotaged their own happiness. For the first time, there's no one left to absorb their emotional distance or make excuses for their detachment. The silence left behind becomes deafening. It forces them to confront the very pain they've been running from, the fear of abandonment that ironically led to actual abandonment. Every moment alone becomes a confrontation with themselves. They start to feel the emotions they've buried for years: regret, longing, guilt, and grief. The absence of the empath's energy becomes a haunting reminder of what real love felt like and what they let slip through their hands. What makes the empath's departure so transformative is that it dismantles the avoidance illusion. It exposes the emptiness behind their defenses. The avoidant begins to understand that love was never the threat avoidance was. The empath's silence teaches them more than any words ever could. It's not filled with resentment but with clarity, and that clarity cuts deep. It shows the avoidant that their coping mechanisms, once meant to protect, have only isolated them. The loss of the empath becomes the catalyst for introspection, the trigger that awakens them to their emotional truth. In their solitude, they start to realize that the person they pushed away was not trying to control them, but to love them, not trying to confine them, but to connect with them. That awareness marks the beginning of their transformation, born from the very heartbreak they once thought they could avoid. When the avoidant finally reaches the point of emotional collapse, something profound begins to happen beneath the pain and awakening. Losing a super empath is not just the loss of a person, it is the loss of a mirror that once reflected back the best and worst parts of them. It strips away every illusion they've built about control, independence, and emotional safety. For perhaps the first time, they are left entirely alone with themselves, with no one left to absorb their fears or interpret their silences. The stillness that follows the empath's departure becomes a kind of reckoning. The avoidant, who has always prided themselves on emotional restraint, begins to feel emotions they can no longer suppress: guilt, longing, regret, and the ache of realizing how much they contributed to their own heartbreak. The same walls they built to keep pain out now keep healing away, and they begin to understand that avoiding love also means avoiding growth. This moment of breakdown can be terrifying because it dismantles the emotional architecture they've depended on their entire lives. Every defense mechanism, withdrawal, detachment, dismissiveness stops working. The distractions that once helped them escape the discomfort of emotional vulnerability no longer bring relief. They might seek temporary comfort in others, dive into work, or try to numb themselves, but nothing fills the void left by the empath's absence. Slowly, they start to recognize that the very thing they ran from, emotional connection, is what they actually needed all along. This realization doesn't come gently. It arrives through restless nights, through unexpected memories, through the ache of seeing the empath thrive without them. They begin to question their choices, to trace back every moment where they could have spoken instead of withdrawing, opened up instead of shutting down. As painful as this stage is, it marks the beginning of transformation. For the first time, the avoidant begins to feel instead of repress. They start confronting their fears: the fear of being unworthy, the fear of rejection, the fear that if someone truly saw them, they would not be enough. In doing so, they begin to break through the emotional armor that's kept them disconnected for so long. This process is not immediate or easy. It's slow, raw, and uncomfortable. But as they sit with their pain, they begin to realize that vulnerability is not a weakness, it's the doorway to genuine connection. The loss of the empath becomes a lesson written in heartbreak, one that teaches them the value of openness, communication, and accountability. The breakdown eventually transforms into a breakthrough when the avoidant starts taking responsibility not just for the relationship's end, but for the patterns that caused it. They begin to understand that love cannot survive where fear dictates every move. They learn that true strength lies not in control, but in the courage to be seen and to feel deeply. Losing the super empath, though devastating, becomes the catalyst for their emotional evolution. It's the pain that pushes them toward self-awareness, the loss that drives them toward emotional maturity, and the silence that teaches them how to finally listen not to others, but to their own heart. In the end, the story of the avoidant and the super empath is not one of villains and victims, but of awakening and growth. Losing a super empath forces the avoidant to confront the truth they've run from all along, that love requires courage, not control, vulnerability, not withdrawal. The empath's departure becomes both an ending and a beginning, teaching the avoidant that real strength is found in emotional honesty and openness. It's a painful lesson, but a necessary one, for it transforms heartbreak into healing and loss into wisdom. Thank you all for listening, for feeling, and for allowing this message to remind us that even the most guarded hearts can learn to love again when they finally choose to face themselves.